meeting today to receive testimony on two bills to compensate residents of Vieques, Puerto Rico for illnesses or diseases resulting from U.S. government use of the island for military readiness. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meeting, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members may be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experience technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. Now, let me recognize myself for the opening statement. We are meeting today to discuss two bills that will provide compensation for residents of Vieques suffering as a result of U.S. military testing on the island. H.R. 1317, sponsored by our colleague, Representative Nidia Velasquez, and H.R. 1126, sponsored by the resident commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, would establish compensation for qualified residents of Vieques and provide medical treatment and transportation for their care. Starting in the early 1940s, more than 80 million tons of ordnance and other weaponry were dropped on the eastern and western portions of Vieques. The result of these exercises was to expose Americans living on the island to the residue of heavy metals and many chemicals that are known to cause harm to human health. The more than 60 years of heavy bombardment contaminated the local food supply, resulting in residents of Vieques having much higher incidence of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and other illnesses. These disparate conditions have been verified and validated by independent health studies of Vieques residents and already proven to be the correct statistics. The disproportionate levels, which we'll hear from the witnesses later, should be concerned to all of us. They're not sustainable, and they have not been sustainable. As a result of sustained protest and pressure in 2003, that was my first year in Congress, by the way, the U.S. Navy withdrew from Vieques, but without leaving in place a program for cleaning up the island and providing compensation for residents. The bills we are considering today, which have been around in one form or another for more than a decade, set up a program to finally begin compensating residents of Vieques who live or have lived on the island and filed administrative claims. The amounts the bill will provide are comparable to what Americans in the Western U.S. received under the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Last December, sponsors of the Vieques Recovery and Redevelopment Act were almost successful in securing inclusion of their bill in the Consolidated Appropriation Acts of 2021. They were able to secure the support of leaders in both the House and the Senate, but ran out of time before they could achieve their goal. Today's hearing is the first step in completing that effort. I want to conclude by welcoming our witnesses and thanking them for taking the time to be here with us today. I want to especially welcome the Mayor of Vieques. Welcome, Mr. Mayor. I look forward to receiving your testimony. The chair now recognizes the vice-ranking minority member and their designee and in this case, the designee is the chair, the ranking member of the Insular Affairs Committee, Representative Gonzalez Colon. For your statement, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you for this hearing on the Recovery and Redevelopment Act of 2021. I think this is an important step towards providing the situation of an American community who helped secure our defense for many, many years. The bill, which I first presented in the last Congress as H.R. 4605, and now this Congress as H.R. 1126, set up the process for claims and compensation for health conditions in the island municipality of Vieques. The U.S. Navy maintained a presence in Vieques for 6 decades, during which American and Allied forces used the island as a training and test range, operating multiple kinds of equipment and weaponry. To this day, the Navy and other agencies are engaged in a cleanup so extensive that the latest GA report, which is I asked to introduce for the record, indicates it will last until 2032. In the 2019 National Defense Reauthorization Act, myself and Representative Ocasio-Cortez included amendments for the application of improved technologies in that cleanup effort. For the same time, the residents continue extremely worried as how that affects their health. In the face of studies and personal experience reflecting higher incidence of many medical conditions. The people of Vieques serve their country, helping America strong, make America strong, and they deserve their country's help to make themselves strong again. Today, the mayor of Vieques, Mayor Jose Corsino, joined us to speak for them. Even prior to Hurricane Maria, Vieques had a limited capacity healthcare facility, and residents needed to travel off island for many medical services. The hurricane destroyed the clinic, and although FEMA finally released the funds for rebuilding last year, the people's concern is when we're going to get a new building, a new facility, and what will we do with it? Because transport between the island of Vieques and the main island of Puerto Rico by ferry has a record of frequent disruption. The people from Vieques want a medical facility that can address both chronic and acute cases that are needed for life-saving medical services to all residents. This is a goal of this bill, beyond individual compensation. Under its provision, a special master appointed by the U.S. Attorney General will evaluate claims, validity, and compensation. Claims for individuals will be documented as to the nature of the case, and their compensations could be up to $110,000 depending on those conditions. The special master will also evaluate any compensation to the municipality of Vieques for expenses incurred and facilitate resources to upgrade the staff and equipment at the medical center to provide full service, regular pediatric and adult care. The care for conditions such as metals toxicity, cancers and diabetes, and transport and telemedicine costs during the upgrade. Acceptance of the compensation will be considered a settlement of claims by the individual or by the municipality. The special master could be also authorized to select an academic partner to conduct further studies and outreach to evaluate strategies for better identifying causes and solutions for the environmental and health conditions in Vieques, including upgrading the power grid. Funding will proceed from the Judgment Fund under Section 1304 of Title 31 U.S. Code, not out of the new appropriations, which is why the bill is also referred to the Judiciary Committee. The nations benefit from the sacrifice of those who lived and are living on Vieques, and we must recognize that and show them that respect and appreciation they deserve. We will hear today from those who know about the issues the closest, and I want to say thank you to Congressman Darren Soto and Congressman Trent Kelly, that are co-sponsors of this bill again during this term. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, the gentlelady yields, and let me inquire of her. Is Mr. Weston going to make a statement? Is he present? I don't have him on the list at this point. Ms. Gonzalez Colon?
I don't have that information at this time.
Okay, thank you. Let me also acknowledge the chair of the Subcommittee on Insular Affairs, Mr. Sablan, Representative Sablan, and who's here, and chose not to have an opening statement and to expedite this hearing and to get the members back to their other responsibilities. Let me remind before I introduce the witnesses, let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rule, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin and it will turn orange when you are 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses join remotely use stage view so that they may pin the timer to their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise, and I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair notes that Mayor Jose Corsino Acevedo is participating with the assistance of an interpreter. To ensure that members are able to hear from the witnesses, I will allow the witnesses to present their opening statements under the 5-minute rule and provide the interpreter 5 minutes so we may hear the translation. This practice is under the chair's right of recognition as described in Rule 4A. Let me begin with our first witnesses and welcome him here. The Honorable Jose Corsino Acevedo, Mayor, Municipality of Vieques. Sir, Mr. Mayor, you're recognized for 5 minutes and the floor is yours.
Okay.
Quiero
Muchas
reconocer a nuestro
Gracias,
invitado.
Grijalva.
Adelante, señor.
No hay que traducir esa parte. Gracias, presidente Grijalva, republicano de más alto rango, Westerman, y miembro de la Comisión de Recursos Naturales de la Cámara de Representantes de los Estados Unidos, por la oportunidad de hablar con ustedes sobre la crisis de salud que está ocurriendo en Vieques, Puerto Rico. Mi nombre es José Corsino Acevedo. He tenido el honor de servir como alcalde de Vieques desde el 11 de enero del 2021 y he vivido en Vieques toda mi vida.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the U.S. House Natural Resources Committee for the opportunity to speak with you about the health crisis occurring on Vieques, Puerto Rico. My name is Jose Corsino Acevedo, and I've had the honor of serving as mayor of Vieques since January 2021, and I've lived in Vieques for my entire life.
En anticipación de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el gobierno de los Estados Unidos compró el 75% de nuestra isla para prepararse para la guerra. Desde entonces, hemos sido el lugar donde el ejército estadounidense se entrenó para defender a este gran país de todos los conflictos de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Recordemos que muchas de estas sustancias tóxicas que se usaron en Vietnam se probaron primero en Vieques. Esto incluye agente naranja, el napalm y el uranio reducido.
In anticipation of entering World War II, the United States government bought 75% of the land of Vieques to prepare war. Since then, we've been the location where the American military has trained to defend this great country in every conflict since World War II. Let us remember that many of the toxic substances that were used in Vietnam were tested in Vieques first. These include Agent Orange, napalm, and depleted uranium.
Hasta que el uso de la isla por parte de los militares terminó en el 2003. Esta isla sirvió como campo de entrenamiento para las bombas, las sustancias químicas y las armas utilizadas en esa guerra. Si bien me enorgullece haber servido a la seguridad de todos los estadounidenses, la realidad inevitable es que cada metal pesado y químico en esas 80 millones de toneladas de municiones están ahora en nuestro medio ambiente, en los alimentos que comemos y ahora en nosotros.
Until the military's use of the island ended in 2003, the island served as the training grounds for the bombs, chemicals, and weapons used in these wars. While I'm proud that we have served every American's security, the unavoidable reality is that every heavy metal and chemical in those 80 million tons of ordnance is now in our environment and in the food we eat and now in us.
Nuestro pueblo. Nosotros, el pueblo de Vieques, tenemos los mismos sueños que otros ciudadanos estadounidenses, pero a diferencia de otros ciudadanos estadounidenses, nosotros solo podemos soñar con tener la oportunidad de vivir la isla sin preocupación constante de nuestro mayor riesgo en desarrollar cáncer o enfermedades extrañas. Soñamos con la posibilidad de ir a un hospital adecuado cuando estamos enfermos y saber cómo protegernos de la contaminación que afecta la vida de todos los que amamos. Personalmente, en mi vida, hay demasiadas personas para contar que han muerto de cáncer. En cada familia de Vieques que conozco, hay alguien que tiene cáncer o que ha muerto de enfermedades causadas por metales pesados. Los primeros que vienen a mi mente son mis tíos, una fiel madre de 3 hijos de 23 años, mis amigos Ramón Sierra y Francisco Pache Pimentel y mi empleada Sandra. Es difícil en Vieques vivir y estar enfermo. Nuestra gente vive con el temor de enfermarse y tener una enfermedad leve porque no hay hospital. Si se enferman por la contaminación, deben soportar un viaje costoso e insoportable a la isla grande de Puerto Rico, con un ferry muy inconsistente. Es mucho problema. A veces debes ir la noche anterior y pagar un carro. A veces debe ir de día y pasar la noche porque el ferry ha dejado de funcionar. En cada viaje debes pagar un taxi desde el puerto de ferry hasta el lugar de tratamiento y viceversa. Imagínese haciendo todo esto mientras tiene náuseas debido a su tratamiento o quimioterapia. Todos estos factores impiden que muchas personas reciban tratamiento. Mucha de nuestra gente ha muerto por complicaciones que son fácilmente tratables en un hospital adecuado.
We, the people of Vieques, have the same dreams of other U.S. citizens, but unlike our fellow citizens elsewhere, we may only dream of having the opportunity to live life with constant worry of our increased risk of developing cancer or strange diseases. We dream of the ability to go to an adequate hospital when we are sick, and to know how to protect ourselves from the contamination that affects the lives of everyone. Personally, in my life, there are too many people to count that have died from cancer. In every family on Vieques that I know someone who has cancer or who has died from illnesses that are caused by heavy metals. The ones that sit in the forefront of my mind include my uncles, a faithful 23-year-old mother of 3, my friends Ramon Sierra and Francisco Pache Pimentel, and my employee, Sandra. It is difficult to live in Vieques and be sick. Our people live in fear of getting sick or have a minor illness because there is no hospital. If they do get sick from the contamination, they must endure an expensive and excruciating trip to the mainland Puerto Rico on a very inconsistent ferry. It's a lot of trouble. Sometimes you must go the night before and pay for an expensive hotel. Sometimes you must go the day of and the night because the ferry has stopped running. Every trip you must pay for a taxi from the ferry port to the place of treatment. Imagine doing all of this while having nausea from your chemo treatment. All of these factors prevent many people from receiving treatment. Many of our people have died of complications that are easily treatable in an adequate hospital.
Necesitamos una estación que provea servicios médicos para el cáncer, las enfermedades cardíacas, la diabetes y todas las demás enfermedades causadas por la contaminación. Además, necesitamos un hospital que tenga la capacidad de investigación para comprender las causas subyacentes únicas de esas enfermedades para que podamos evitar enfermarnos en primer lugar. Parece que cada año se dan a conocer estudios que nos siguen diciendo que lo enfermos que estamos. Según la Escuela Postgrado de Planificación de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, la isla de Vieques tiene una tasa de cáncer 269% más alta, una tasa de enfermedades cardíacas 77% más alta y una tasa de diabetes un 58% más alta del resto de Puerto Rico. Además, la Oficina de Estadísticas Vitales de Puerto Rico encontró que las muertes en Vieques por enfermedades hepáticas son 95% más altas y la mortalidad infantil fue 55% más alta que el resto de Puerto Rico. La cantidad de personas que han muerto a causa de esta crisis es impresionante. Pero para los que vivimos en Vieques, esto no solo son números, sino madres, niños y padres. Tenemos gente realmente trabajadora, pero no tenemos todos los recursos para construir y administrar un hospital o para llevar a cabo la investigación científica necesaria.
We need a facility that treats heart disease, diabetes, and all the other illnesses caused by contamination. In addition, we need a hospital that has the research capability to understand the unique underlying causes of those illnesses so that we can avoid getting sick in the first place. It seems like every year a couple of studies come out that continue to tell us how sick we are. According to the University of Puerto Rico Graduate School of Planning, the island of Vieques has a 269% higher rate of cancer, a 73% higher rate of heart disease, and a 58% rate of diabetes than Puerto Rico. In addition, the Puerto Rico Bureau of Vital Statistics found that deaths on Vieques due to liver disease are 95% higher, and infant mortality was 55% higher than Rico. The amount of people that have died from this crisis is astounding. But to live in Vieques, these are not just numbers. These are mothers and children and fathers. We have really hardworking people, but we do not have all of the resources to build and manage a hospital or to carry out the necessary research.
Este proyecto de ley proporciona todo lo que necesitamos para comenzar a abordar las crisis que tenemos aquí en la isla. Además, esto nos hará sentir que nuestros sacrificios al país son apreciados. Este proyecto de ley hace tres cosas. Primero, proporciona hasta 110,000 para ciudadanos que tienen 3 enfermedades graves. En segundo lugar, el proyecto de ley proporciona el hospital que realmente necesitamos y da a los enfermos de contaminación la posibilidad de utilizarlo sin costo alguno. Finalmente, nos proporciona la investigación que necesitamos para poner fin a este círculo vicioso de enfermedades que seguimos teniendo debido a las toxinas en nuestro entorno. Esto se trata de justicia. Simplemente estamos pidiendo que se nos trate como cualquier otro ciudadano estadounidense sería tratado en esta situación. Cada ciudadano de Vieques recibirá una compensación similar a la que reciben los estadounidenses del oeste cuando se le diagnosticó cáncer por exposición a la radiación en virtud a la ley de compensación por exposición a la radiación. El proyecto de ley de recuperación y desarrollo de Vieques es una oportunidad para hacer historia al ofrecer una solución integral que nos brinda lo que realmente necesitamos para reconstruir y restaurar nuestra capacidad de perseguir el sueño americano. No quiero que el próximo alcalde tenga que seguir lidiando con esta crisis de salud que afecta a todos los aspectos de la vida de nuestra gente. Quiero que nuestros hijos se enteren de esta crisis humanitaria en los libros de historia, no mientras reciben quimioterapia.
This bill will provide everything we need to begin addressing the crisis we have here on the island. In addition, this will make us feel like our sacrifices to the country are appreciated. This bill does 3 things. First, this bill provides up to $110,000 for citizens who have 3 serious illnesses. Secondly, the bill provides the hospital we truly need and gives those who are sick from contamination the ability to use it without cost. Finally, it provides us with the research we need to put an end to this vicious cycle of illness that we continue to have due to the toxins in our environment. This is an issue of justice. We are simply asking to be treated like every other American citizen would be in this situation. Each citizen on Vieques will receive compensation similar to what Western Americans were given when they were diagnosed with cancer from radiation exposure under the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. The Vieques Recovery and Development Act is an opportunity to make history by providing a comprehensive solution that gives us what we truly need to build and restore our ability to the American dream. I do not want the next mayor to have to continue to deal with this health crisis that affects every aspect of these citizens' lives. I want our children to learn about this humanitarian crisis in history books, not while receiving chemo.
Quiero darle las gracias a la congresista Anida Velázquez y a Jennifer González por trabajar junto a esta medida y a todos los congresistas que apoyan. Miembros de esta comisión, con esto concluyo mi declaración. Sería un honor responder cualquier pregunta que puedan hacer.
I would like to thank Representative Gonzalez Colon as well as Representative Velasquez for all the work and everybody else that supported this project. And members of the committee, this concludes my statement, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. We appreciate it very much, your testimony and for the labor and representation you're providing to the people of Vieques, and very much appreciated. Señor alcalde, muchísimas gracias por su presentación y por su labor y representación de su gente en Vieques. Muchísimas gracias. Let me now introduce our next witnesses, Ms. Mirna Pagan, member, Vidas Viequeñeses, Valen. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Esteemed Chairman, Mr. Raúl Grijalva, Mr. Westerman, and members of the House Natural Resources Committee. With every passing day, the human rights of the people of Vieques are violated and their lives endangered. I speak to you as a Viequense mother, abuela, soon to be great-grandmother, and in representation of the Vidas Viequenses Valen grassroots movement. My name is Mirna Pagan, and I wholeheartedly support HR 1317 and HR 1126. I am grateful for the opportunity to contribute to your knowledge of the Vieques situation, one where military exercises and experimentation with non-conventional weapons for more than 6 decades created a legacy of contamination that affects us to this day. 4 generations of Vieques citizens have suffered from the toxics that rained upon them in the shape of bombs and rockets, uranium agent orange, napalm, and toxic metals, poisoning the air we breathe, our coastal waters where we fish and swim, and the land that once fed our people. The 1/3 of our paradise where our people were sandwiched between the areas for military games and ammunition storage still houses the civilian population of second-class American citizens. There are less than 9,000 of us now, and our municipal cemetery fills to capacity too quick. The health crisis for survivors of the bombing practice era continues to this day and exists as a moral as well as existential problem. The injustice of using a tiny island for bombing, converting citizens to collateral damage statistics, was immoral and screams for reparation. The devastation of our natural resources and disregard for our right to good health and livelihood in a clean environment where youth and elders can thrive is a sin against their existence. Health is life. Sin salud no hay vida. We're here to plead that justice be done for Vieques now. The Vieques Recovery and Redevelopment Act of 2021 is a comprehensive solution, which aside from providing compensation, would commission scientific research for addressing and resolving environmental and health concerns that plague us. We could become a source of well-being for our entire archipelago and neighbors, and we must stop this vicious cycle of illness that comes from contamination. Let us commence with the establishment of a complete hospital with chemotherapy, kidney dialysis, and a maternity ward so that our babies can be born in their home island. Access to medical helicopter service is mandated for emergency transport when required for our isolated community. Aside from the necessary and really basic solutions contemplated in this bill, I must mention the fact that unless we install proper detonation chambers for the cleanup of the Superfund site, the National Academy of Sciences warns that the contamination and therefore sickness will continue. We have a duty to our children and future generations to close this period of abuse and neglect. Our children are struggling for life. Aidelis Moreno Ventura, a 13-year-old child, convulsing and lacking oxygen, died in the provisional clinic, which offers us meager medical service since our island was devastated in 2017 by Hurricane Maria. Precious golden hours passed while life-saving measures and CPR were administered by paramedics and crying family members manually for lack of a respirator. End the abuse and neglect. Honor our existence. Justice for Vieques now. Vidas Viequenses valen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pagan, and I appreciate it very much. Let me now introduce Dr. Kevin Gardner, Executive Vice President for Research and Innovation, University of Louisville. Doctor, you're recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on innovative remediation strategies that could significantly improve the lives of the residents of Vieques, as well as the environment of the island, as the committee considers the Vieques Recovery and Redevelopment Act. My name is Kevin Gardner, and I am the Executive Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Louisville, and I'm a registered professional environmental engineer and received a PhD in civil and environmental engineering in 1996. Over my research career, I've published over 60 manuscripts and received research funding in excess of $60 million from the National Science Foundation, Environmental Protection Agency, the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, which is Department of Defense's Environmental Science and Technology Program, and the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, which is DoD's Environmental Technology Demonstration and Validation Program, among other agencies. My work is focused on understanding how contaminants become available to be released to the natural environment, and from there, how they can lead to human exposure. This includes how they move into complex aquatic food chains, and importantly, my work is focused on approaches and technologies that can interrupt the pathways that ultimately lead to human exposure. The history of environmental contamination on the island and environs of Vieques is sobering. The complex mixture of different types of contaminants, the complex environment of the island, and the multiple exposure pathways make any simple assessment impossible. The US Navy reported it had dropped between 3 and 4 million pounds of ordnance on Vieques each year from 1983 to 1998. Studies have found very high levels of many munitions-related contaminants in humans, livestock, crops, marine seafood, marine plants, and algae. It is clear that the contamination on Vieques is significant and that the association between contamination expected from ordnance, contamination found in humans, and contamination found in many of the pathways that would translate contaminants from the environment into humans is also present. To reduce contamination level in humans, it is critical to evaluate and understand the pathways by which humans are exposed to contaminants through ingestion, inhalation, or dermal contact. Understanding and quantifying the significant pathways provides opportunity to interrupt that pathway and thereby reduce human exposure. On the island of Vieques, with the severity of contamination and the significant disease burden, I would first and foremost recommend that any remedial efforts are directed at ways to reduce human exposure, as contrasted with notions about restoring the island to its natural condition. Focusing on reducing exposures is the most efficacious approach to lessening the disease burden and minimizing the significant health inequities present in the people of Vieques. The likely significant pathways on Vieques include ingestion of fish and seafood, ingestion of crops grown in soils that have been contaminated, ingestion of meat and dairy grown on pasture lands and fed locally grown crops, ingestion and or contact with contaminated water, and inhalation of dust. My own research and that of many other researchers over past decades have developed approaches to reduce exposures, including remediation alternatives that can be deployed remotely in areas where significant unexploded ordnance are present. This process necessarily starts with research that quantifies the most significant exposure pathways, which can lead to identifying the most cost-effective and expedient approaches to cut off or significantly reduce continued exposure. For example, there was one technology demonstration through the DoD's ESTCP program at the Vieques site where underwater munitions are present, and the project team validated the ability of a technique that measures bioavailable concentrations of organic munitions constituents, TNT and RDX, which is a critical need to enable quantification of an exposure pathway. While there may be pounds of a chemical constituent present or tons, those are not the masses or concentrations relevant for biouptake and transfer up the aquatic food chain to humans. Remediation specifically targeted at reducing human exposure requires techniques to measure relevant concentrations and technologies to target cutting off exposure pathways. In the case of bioconcentration of a chemical up a food chain, this means targeting the bioavailable concentrations that result in uptake into the food chain. This may be bioavailable concentrations in sediment, which ends up in seafood, like crab or finfish, or concentrations in soils that get taken up into a crop that is consumed by humans or livestock. Remedial approaches have been developed in recent years to target reducing bioavailable concentrations, and these types of innovative methods are precisely what need to be applied, adapted, and further developed to the grossly contaminated island of Vieques. Through research and development, innovative solutions targeted at reducing exposure can be developed, tested, and implemented that can address the environmental exposures and ongoing health inequities faced by the people of Vieques. Thank you for allowing me to provide this testimony today.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. We'll now proceed with questions from committee members. A 5-minute limit on those questions. As members know, the chair remind members that under the chair's right of recognition, as described in Committee Rule 3D, we will provide some reasonable additional time whenever any member has a question for Mayor Acevedo to account for the interpreter's time. Members are encouraged to ask all questions in English to avoid complications with the interpretation. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask. Let me begin with the sponsor of HR 1317, Representative Nidia Velasquez. The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this important hearing, important for the people of Vieques. Hurricane Maria wreaked havoc in Puerto Rico and badly hit the island of Vieques. And ever since, I have been advocating to ensure funds are not only allocated to Puerto Rico overall, but that they reach the islands of Vieques and Culebra. I pressed the Trump administration repeatedly to make sure that FEMA funds were diverted for the construction of a new hospital. And in fact, Speaker Pelosi convened a meeting with FEMA administrator, and days later, the agency formally announced that $39.5 million were approved for the new hospital back on January 2020. Unfortunately, more than a year has passed and there's still no medical facility in Vieques. That is one of the reasons why we are here. So, Mr. Mayor, could you please update the committee on the status of the hospital construction?
Muchas gracias al presidente Grijalva y le quiero dar la bienvenida a nuestros invitados. Desde el huracán María, yo he estado abogando para que se asigne fondos para Puerto Rico en general, pero también en particular para las islas de Vieques y Culebra. Estuve ejerciendo mucha presión sobre el gobierno de Trump para que fondos de FEMA fuesen asignados para apoyar esta causa. Y con la ayuda de la representante Pelosi, pues en enero del 2020 se aprobó $39.5 millones para este propósito. Infelizmente ya ha pasado un año y todavía no hay instalaciones médicas en la isla de Vieques. Entonces, mi pregunta es para el alcalde Corcevedo nos podría actualizar en cuanto al estado de la construcción del nuevo hospital?
Claro que sí. Yo entré en enero 11 de 2021 y durante ese año, ¿verdad? Desde enero, desde el 2020 no se había hecho ningún tipo de gestión. Nosotros ahora mismo pues hemos trabajado desde enero 11 para agilizar ese proceso de tener un hospital para Vieques. Ya hoy estamos en la segunda etapa para poder, lo que es el modelo conceptual para el hospital.
Gracias. Thank you. Ms. Pagan, Mirna Pagan, thank you for your advocacy and dedication to your community. Your testimony poignantly describes your cancer story and the hardship endured by your family and embodies the tragedy experienced by residents of Vieques. Could you please describe what residents of Vieques with cancer have to endure in order to undergo treatment?
Thank you, Ms. Velasquez. Well, starting with the agony of knowing what you're going to have to go through, what people have been going through for decades now. The trip over to the Big Island is very costly if you can afford to go by plane. Very cheap if you can afford to go by ferry, except that the ferry service is totally undependable. The treatment on the ferry is inhumane for anyone who is sick going over to the Big Island, as most people, for treatment, because we have no treatment, no chemo on the island. You make the trip over on the ferry, it's about an hour. The agony, the stress, all adding to your condition. Then finally landing in Ceiba now, which is a ride at least an hour long, mostly an hour and a half, to get to the San Juan area for treatment, for dialysis, or for chemotherapy, or to see any kind of specialist, because we have no specialists on service on the island of Vieques. So you get your treatment and you have to repeat the odyssey back from San Juan in by car to Ceiba, which is an hour and a half, wait for the ferry and hope that it's running, get on the ferry feeling sick, you and an accompaniment. Somebody must accompany the sick all the time. So it becomes a whole family involved in the trip. The trip and the
Ms.
danger.
Pagan, could you wrap up the answer as soon as possible, please?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Inhumane. It cannot continue, and it cries for service on the island.
Thank you.
For the sick. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And
Please.
Ms. Pagan, we will continue to fight to make sure that the U.S. Congress right this wrong on the people of Vieques. I yield back.
And lady yields, and appreciate her advocacy and the strength that she lent to assuring that this is a priority item going forward. And I appreciate her efforts in that regard, and Ms. Gonzalez Colon's efforts to continue to bring forward the legislation that is required in order to begin to make the situation in Vieques and for those residents begin the initial, I think, almost an initial step to making their lives and their island whole again. But with that, let me now ask The resident commissioner from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez Colon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do have some question, and I would like to begin with Dr. Gardner, if you don't mind. Can you describe the health effects from percolate?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Describe the health effects
Of perchlorate?
of perchlorate. So my area of expertise is really about the contamination, its movement in the environment, and the ways that humans get exposed and the body burdens of those. So the connection between body burden or being exposed to a chemical, and then the effects of that, and the health effects of that, and so forth, and the epidemiology of that, it really aren't my area of expertise. So I don't think that's I'm just not well versed in that.
Do you know where those perchlorate come from?
Yeah, there's a number of different types of sources that would be associated with many different activities that would be typical of such a large, complex organization as as occurred on Puerto Rico for all those many years.
I brought those issues because my office has some documents from the United States Environmental Protection Agency from 1995 and 1993. They're part of the vast and robust case that was brought for the Navy. And there's a lot of information regarding that. And of course, EPA standards currently do not require testing of this. In 1992, it was the first recognition by Navy itself of contaminations of fuels in Vieques water. So this is just one of the testaments of how difficult it's been for the island of Vieques managing. And the reason behind this bill, we're not talking just about trying to fix what happened already. I think, first of all, I want to say thank you to the mayor for representing your constituents as well as our other witnesses. But I know it's never easy time to assume this duty in a place like Vieques, and in the last few years has been especially very tough, and having the situation, and that's the reason we are trying to compensate individuals in Vieques and the community, not to constitute a judgment against or any rejection of the armed forces. I think the National Defense Mission is vitally necessary, but it's not always pleasant and it's not always safe. And that's just a fact. But that does not mean that if someone is hurt as a result, they should be not taken care of. A soldier can be wounded in battle or in an accident while on duty, and they get treatment and compensation. I think Vieques residents feel they did their duty too. So this is kind of the compensations we are looking for. We are not trying, and these bills are not to relitigate what happened between 1999 and 2003. We're trying to address the needs and worries of residents of Vieques as per today. And that's the reason this bill is not having a direct appropriation. We're just taking the fund that has already been there in the Department of Justice, and we heard about the struggles from the people of Vieques, not just from the mayor, but by Ms. Pagan and many others who visited the island. My next question will be, in knowing about the hospital. I mean, this bill is not to build a hospital. When we talked with Administrator Gaynor of FEMA during the last 2 years, and many members of Congress did their part as well, but the Trump administration actually released those funds in January of last year. Sadly, the municipality of Vieques was not even taking the measures necessary to do the planification and of course the planning, as I just said, to the design and make this happen. And I thank the mayor to put a fast track on these efforts, and having at least this time the designing phase of the hospital or the clinic with the government of Puerto Rico, the Department of Health, and many other agencies because we want to see that hospital being built. But again, a hospital is being built. How are we going to pay the services? How are we going to pay the equipment? How are we going to maintain those operations on the island with safety? And that's one of the reasons this bill is so important. And I know my time has expired, Mr. Chairman, so I'll keep some questions to the record. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields. Let me now recognize Representative Sablan, sir. You're recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Grijalva. Thank you for holding this hearing. Mayor Orsino Acevedo, for over 40 years, sir, one of the smaller islands in my district in the Northern Mariana Islands is continually bombed and used for aerial target practice and training by our military. Unfortunately, sir, it is uninhabited, unlike your island of Vieques, so residents are not directly impacted by the heavy metals and other potentially toxic substance left behind by the bombardment. However, the military is now proposing to develop additional live fire training ranges in 2 more islands of the Marianas, one of which does have a sizable population. And understandably, many are concerned about the safety for residents, effects on public health, damage to the environment, and the eventual required cleanup afterwards. The legislation we are talking about here today would provide funds to residents of Vieques to get transportation, to adequate health care, and take care of the medical costs associated with some of the impacts of the heavy metals left by the military. So, Mayor, in your opinion, what would be the impact of this assistance to the community in Vieques?
Muchas gracias, presidente Grijalva, y muchas gracias por convocar esta reunión. Mi pregunta pues será para el alcalde Acevedo. Durante más de 40 años, en una de las islas menores de mi región, en las Islas Marianas del Norte, se ha utilizado esta isla para realizar maniobras militares, entre otros bombardeos, etcétera. Pero felizmente, y a diferencia de Vieques, en esta isla pues no hay habitantes y por tanto no lidiamos con los efectos de las sustancias tóxicas ni los efectos de los metales pesados. Pero ahora el ejército está proponiendo realizar operaciones militares en 2 islas pequeñas, 2 otras, donde en una sí hay una población de personas y se tendría que lidiar con los daños a las personas, incluso los daños que se darían en el medio ambiente y claro, lidiar con la eventual limpieza de la contaminación. Ahora, este proyecto de ley pues proporcionará compensación, indemnización para las personas y el pueblo de Vieques para apoyar el desarrollo de pues unas instalaciones para prestar servicios de salud y para lidiar con los costes médicos debido a la exposición a los metales pesados. Mi pregunta para ustedes, en su opinión, ¿cuál es el impacto que tendrá este proyecto de ley o esta ley? ¿Cuál es el impacto que tendrá para el pueblo de Vieques?
Gracias, congresista Sablan, por su pregunta. El impacto que tendría es que esto sería, ¿verdad? Primero que ayudaría a las personas que están enfermas en Vieques a tener un hospital con los servicios que se merecen, ya que la contaminación en Vieques es muy grande. Y segundo, le diría que Dios quiere no llegue a bombardear la isla y población porque pasaría por muchos daños, ¿verdad? La población ya existente en ella.
The interpreter would like to ask Mr. Corsino to repeat the second part. ¿Puede repetir la segunda parte? Es que se cortó la conexión.
La segunda parte es que me gustaría que, digo, no que me gustaría, sino que pues lamento mucho de que vayan a bombardear una isla que está poblada porque van a sufrir muchos de los efectos que estamos nosotros hoy en día sufriendo y sería devastador para ellos.
Thank you so much, Representative Sablan, for your question. Of course, the impact that this bill would have for our people would be that it would provide compensation, monetary compensation for those who are ill, as well as a hospital with proper services that the people deserve. And secondly, I would just like to express my sympathy regarding the proposal to use your island for military operations, because I know your population will suffer like ours is currently suffering.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Thank you to his interpreter. And Mr. Chairman, my time is up. I yield.
Gentleman yields. Thank you, Mr. Sablan. And now recognize Representative Radwagen. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Westerman. Thank you all for testifying today. I would like to yield my time to Resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Radwagen, for yielding the time. I appreciate that. I got a question for the mayor, and in order to expedite the time, I will make it in Spanish. Alcalde, ¿usted está consciente de algún pozo privado o comercial que esté en operación en el agua, pozos de agua?
Gracias, comisionada. ¿Me puede repetir la pregunta, por favor?
Si usted está en conocimiento de que hay algún pozo de agua o conexión privada de agua operacional en Vieques en este momento.
Correcto. Hay pozos, tengo conocimiento de que hay pozos que están contaminados de agua aquí en la isla municipio de Vieques.
¿Pozos privados?
Pozos privados, correcto.
Okay.
Y hay pozos públicos que deben estar contaminados también, porque esto es el acuífero completo, la isla municipio de Vieques.
¿Usted tiene conocimiento si la Autoridad de Acueductos Alcantarillados o la EPA ha aprobado los mismos?
No tengo ese conocimiento todavía.
¿Cómo ustedes reciben el agua cuando hay situaciones de emergencia o desastre?
Cuando hay, bueno, cuando hay el huracán hubo a través de los pozos que extraían bajo tierra.
Okay. Now I'll say this in English for the record of the committee. I just asked the mayor if there were any private or commercial wells in operation on the island, and if they undergo EPA or PRASA, which is Puerto Rico Aqueduct Sewer Authority testing. And I also made a question about how those Vieques Island receive water during natural resources versus during regular times. And the reason for this kind of questions and the answer the mayor gave us is that there's a lot of records, even from the Navy, for may having contamination in the distribution of waters at that time. So we will try to make those questions as well to the Puerto Rico Water Authority process. And I thank you for your answer. I do have another question to you, Mayor. In one of those, and I know we've been talking about diseases, some people are putting some doubt about the direct cause of those diseases and you know the treatments, but and I know there's a cleaning effort from the Defense Department, and that is going to expect to continue through the 2032. And I just want the committee to introduce to the record the report to the Congressional Committee of the General Accounting Office of March of 2021 of the military sites in Vieques and Culebra as part of the record, if the chairman allows that to happen.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Will you say, and this is a question to the mayor, that the conditions in Vieques are safe for seasonal visitors, or there's still some areas that are closed to people living on the island?
Esta pregunta es para el alcalde. ¿Diría usted que las condiciones son seguras para recibir a visitantes de temporada, o todavía hay regiones de la isla que se encuentran cerradas?
Sí, son bastante seguras, pero hay lugares en la isla donde ahora mismo está Fish and Wildlife que están contaminadas y se expone la gente que visita esas áreas, ¿verdad? Esos contaminantes. No obstante, también hay explosivos sin detonar en todas esas áreas que hay, pues, o que los visitantes acceden a ellas, como las playas que se han encontrado.
Yes, I would say that is rather safe. However, there are places on the island. There are places on the island that still are contaminated, but we do have unexploded ordnance all over the island, including on beaches where visitors may frequent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Let me now recognize Representative from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chair Grijalva, and thank you to the witnesses for testifying today. The stories that you have told of the damage and the lingering effects of the weapons testing is heartbreaking. It is something that we are familiar with here in New Mexico, in the sense that, as you all know, the initial atomic tests were made here in New Mexico, and we continue to suffer the consequences of the nuclear testing, to suffer the consequences of uranium mining and the winds that blow and blow those contaminants around. And indeed, you recognize the importance of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, which is a model for what you're trying to do here today, to try to provide some recompense for the victims and the people and residents of Vieques. I will be reintroducing RECA, since it will be expiring in 2022. Ms. Pagan, the situation in Vieques is undoubtedly an environmental justice issue. Unfortunately, NOAA is often Hispano, tribal, and other minority communities that suffer the most from these kind of contamination sites. Could you explain a bit about, in addition to damaging the critical infrastructure, such as the local hospital, did Hurricane Maria also further spread existing contaminants? And how might that affect the number of Viequenses going forward?
Well, not being a medical person, but yes, being a resident and having 9 grandchildren on the island, the effects of the toxics after Maria, the period after Maria, were so evident, especially in respiratory diseases and the lack of electricity for almost a year on the island. The neglect on the part of the whole island of the Big Island and Vieques were so terribly devastated with Maria, so that attention to what was happening in Vieques was more on a back burner, because there was so much tragedy on the Big Island. And as an underserved community and an isolated community, which is facing at the moment the new hurricane season, and things have been happening so slowly as far as instating any kind of medical services for us. It's a very frightening prospect to consider what is going to happen to us in this hurricane season. However, there has been a reunification of forces and energies on the island to prepare ourselves with radio systems. And one of the major things, though, is that the medical services which we have now are being offered in what was the one refuge center. So if it strikes again, and it will, no refuge center or no medical services. The situation is critical, and the health of the people has not improved at all. As I say, every time you go by our cemetery, you know the number of people who are dying from illnesses that cannot be taken care of on our island. We need local medical service. We need dialysis. We need a maternity ward, because the suffering for a cancer patient is the same for a mother who is going into labor.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Tremendous.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pagan, for sharing the urgent needs on the island with us. Chair Grijalva, my time has expired. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Let me recognize Representative Moore. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Grateful for everyone who's joined us. It's an important issue. It's my hope that today's conversation will help us better understand the residual effects of military testing in Vieques. Most of my questions will be to Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner, on the topic of environmental decontamination, can you provide us with some examples of cost-effective cleanup methods and how they compare to some of the more traditional remediation methods?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Representative Moore. I'll use an example to start out with that the volume or the mass of contaminants is not really what matters, but what matters is how that moves into the human body. So my phone here is filled with toxic contaminants, but it's in my phone, so it's okay. So if we think about a traditional method of cleanup, may involve removing all of the contaminated media, the soil or the sediment in the marine area, for example, and those can be extremely costly and may not be very effective at what we really care about, which is that human health. So another approach is, for example, using a material that can sequester, that can capture the bioavailable concentration and stop it from being transported to marine organisms that go into the food system. So for example, activated carbon is used in water treatment all the time. People have those in their homes. Activated carbon has been used in marine sediment systems where the activated carbon is deposited or mixed into the surface layer of the sediment where the biouptake occurs. So that's an example. Instead of removing huge volumes of sediment and then having to put those somewhere in some contained place, adding activated carbon to a marine sediment or to a soil can sequester those contaminants in place.
Thank you. That's thorough. I appreciate that. What are the risks that some of these diseases can be passed down genetically? Can you speak to that?
Oh boy, that's a great question that I can't speak to. That's really outside my area of expertise.
Excellent, thanks. Have researchers been able to determine whether the prevalence of contamination-related diseases has increased or decreased with time?
So I think that there's in the studies that I've seen that there's strong linkage between environmental contamination on the island and the prevalence and type of disease that's seen on the island. So terms of the temporal trajectory of that, I really don't know that there are data around, to demonstrate that. And if there are, I'm not aware of those data.
Excellent. Something more related to your testimony. You touched on how munitions-related contaminants are found in Vieques residents and in livestock, crops, marine seafood, marine plants, and algae. How exactly does this contaminate? How do these contaminants or this contamination get absorbed?
So there's a lot of ways that can occur. There can be munitions present in a sediment, for example, in one of those areas, and the slow leakage of contamination into sediment, and then marine organisms that live in sediment can be directly exposed to that. And those marine organisms that live in sediment oftentimes are the base of the food chain. So from that marine organism, it moves up the food chain on something that feeds on that worm or whatever it is, and up to a fish, into a larger fish, to a larger fish, and into humans. That's the story with, everybody knows the story of mercury in tuna fish. That's how that happens. It starts with a bacteria in sediment. It moves up the food chain and into fish and into the apex predators like tuna fish that we consume.
Excellent. Thank you. I'll wrap up. I like to just reiterate, I appreciate one of your first pieces of information you provided was just that we do care about how this affects human life and human health is what you said. And I couldn't agree more. I want to make sure that is very, very clear, supportive of this, with elements of this needing to be evaluated, using this as an opportunity for a sincere, objective fact-finding mission. We can take the proper action. Our office is supportive of that. I'm quite certain that many of us and all of us on this committee could agree to that aspect of it. So thank you for being here, and to the other witnesses. And I will yield back.
Thank you very much. Let me recognize gentleman from Florida, Mr. Sotos. Congressman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. The story of Vieques is a tragedy, and sadly, it's not an isolated one. In our own district in Central Florida, the Pine Castle Jeep Range was a 12,483 acre site near Orlando International Airport in East Orlando, an area where many of us Puerto Ricans live. Between 1943 and 1946, the government leased the land for training and military demonstrations, weapons, and warfare capabilities. In the late 1940s, when the military no longer needed the property, it returned it to the original owners. The Army Corps of Engineers had to conduct a thorough investigation through places like Odyssey Middle School, Tivoli Gardens, and Lee Vista Square, and found and dug up between 2007 and 2009 over 400 bombs, rockets, grenades, and other munitions. In an egregious case, the Army Corps had to come back in 2013 to dig up munitions that were buried under the middle school's running track. Frightening stuff. The U.S. military has seen a similar situation as the U.S. Navy has bombed the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico as part of its training exercises, starting in 1941 in preparation of World War II. All the way until 2001, we saw those training operations, and then completely left the island in 2003. Heavy metals have contaminated the local food supply, caused cancer clusters, diabetes, and heart disease among the local populations as a result of these bombing exercises. And Hurricane Maria only exacerbated the situation by destroying medical facilities there. The residents of Vieques were even denied relief in federal court under Sanchez v. U.S. for their loss of life, illnesses, and other damages. It's time for Congress to step up. That's why I'm proud to support H.R. 1317, the Vieques Recovery and Redevelopment Act of 2021 that we're reviewing today, to set up a compensation fund for the families who've lost so much because of these military bombings, and also its sister bill, H.R. 1126, which provides a similar structure. We also have a tremendous opportunity to build back better in Vieques. Finally, disaster relief is flowing to the island, and it'll be key to help with the hospital there. the American Rescue Act was the first time that Puerto Rico was treated equally for the benefits and rescue funds from the COVID pandemic. And we are committed to treating Puerto Rico equally under the American Jobs Plan to build back better back on the island. Alcalde Cristina Acevedo, gracias por existiendo ahí y por liderazando en nuestra comunidad. My question to you is, why do you think the health problems in Vieques have gone on for so long without being addressed properly?
Muchas gracias. Mi pregunta es para el alcalde José Corsino Acevedo y la pregunta es, ¿por qué cree usted que los problemas de salud de Vieques han persistido tanto sin atenderse adecuadamente?
Gracias, congresista Darren. Una de las causas, ¿verdad?, es que no tenemos las facilidades adecuadas, no tenemos tampoco, ¿verdad?, los servicios necesarios para aquí, para atender la población de Vieques. Y todavía pues seguimos en la contaminación, ya que siguen explotando los explosivos que encuentran y seguimos contaminando a la gente de Vieques, y la gente de Vieques pues sigue enfermando sobre eso. Un problema que lleva tantos años, es difícil, 60 años bombardeo, y ahora lo que se encuentran la limpieza, que siguen bombardeando lentamente nuestra isla, sin querer queriendo, como uno dice, porque siguen explotando esos explosivos que están allí.
Thank you so much, Representative Soto, for the question. Well, the causes of this are because we lack medical facilities, we lack the medical services to support the people of Vieques, and there continues to this day to be contamination because they do continue to detonate the unexploded munitions that they do find. And so the people of Vieques continue to suffer. At first during the 60-year period of all-out training, and then now with the cleanup, we do continue to be periodically bombed as they find the unexploded munitions on the island.
Thank you. And one question for Dr. Gardner. Are we saying at this point that in Vieques they can't eat the fish, they can't eat the livestock, they can't eat the crops, they can't drink the water there? Is that the short-term solution that you're recommending is necessary in order to avoid exposure?
Well, there's no question that livestock and fish and shellfish are heavily contaminated, but I don't know that it's realistic to say don't do that. Don't eat the fish that you need to eat to feed your family. So, but those may be the kinds of solutions, like bottled water being provided when a situation happens when people can't drink the water. So it's possible that those types of immediate steps could be taken if there's some type of particular fish or shellfish that is being consumed heavily that also has dangerous levels of chemicals. That type of thing might be an interim solution while the pathway to those fish gets turned off by further investigation.
Thank you. And I just want to end by saying that lives in Vieques do have value, and thank you also to Ms. Pagan for being here today with Vidas Viequenses Valen, and I yield back.
Expired. Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman yields. Let me now recognize Representative Obernolt. Joe Wexler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all of our witnesses for the testimony on this very important topic. I have a couple of questions for Dr. Gardner. First of all, just to be clear on this, how definitive from a scientific standpoint is the link between the ordnance that's expended over the island and the heavy metals contamination that's found in the soil and the local flora and fauna?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that the association between those in the spatial patterns of their deposition and so forth seems to me to be solid evidence that that's the case. That those, those activities and the signature that you would expect from those ordinances and so forth are consistent with what is seen in the environment.
And continuing with the line of questioning from Representative Soto, can you talk a little bit more about the ways that we might interrupt the pathways for transmission of these contaminants into humans?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think the first thing is to really understand that. And I think that we don't have a full understanding of the dietary sources of those contaminants and so forth. So I think that there's work to do to make sure we understand where we can interrupt that. But it could be, for example, that there are livestock grazing on lands that are contaminated, for example, and so understanding that and knowing that those livestock are being eaten by a certain population of people. Now we can think about ways that we can have the livestock either grazing in a different area while that area gets remediated, but it's possible to add, as the example I gave, adding activated carbon, a really common safe compound, to soils to sequester contaminants that may be in the soil associated with dust or other types of deposition that happen there, is an example of a way that cropland can be restored so that crops can be grown and those livestock can be grazed safely. But I think the key really to start with is to understand where the major exposure pathways are coming from to figure out the strategies to cut those off.
Sure. Well, so you talked about wildlife. What about, you also mentioned dust inhalation. You also mentioned sea life. What could be done to interrupt those pathways?
Yeah, so there's no quick fix for some of those. If there is, my understanding is that dust was a significant source to contaminate soils, and from there, oftentimes that dust can get mixed into those soils and be present there for many, many years as crops are grown on those soils. The dust inhalation issue would have to be dealt with perhaps by covering areas with topsoil that's clean, that doesn't have those. But things like marine resources, fish and shellfish and so forth, those are there's no quick fix to doing that. So it's recognizing that is a pathway. Interim measures like providing other sources of fish or so forth to feed people, and then remediating the sediment area or whatever areas are contributing to that food chain, to that end up in that fish that the people are eating. So it's not an immediate fix. It's not going to happen overnight. It won't be next year. It won't be the year after. It's many years out that if a remediation action takes place, removing sediment or capping the sediment so that it shuts off that pathway, it's going to take time for essentially the fish in the food chain to kind of die off and clean itself and regenerate.
Well, I think we're all incentivized to help the people of Puerto Rico make that happen as soon as possible. But thank you for the testimony. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Let me recognize Representative Bentz. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this question is for Dr. Gardner. Dr. Gardner, I have a nephew who is has an environmental cleanup firm located in Hawaii, and he spends a great deal of his time and his company's time traveling around Pacific Rim countries cleaning up old Navy and Army and other World War II battle sites, many of which sound very similar to what we're looking at here. And that effort has been ongoing for many years. I'm going to say 15 or 20, at least in his instant situation. It appears to me, and by the way, of course, there's that Hanford situation we have out in Oregon and Washington, where people downwind from it, the Hanford site suffered and still do, I suppose, from the plumes of radioactive dust that blew across that site over the years. And each of these situations presents its own challenge. All of them appear to have occurred as a result of efforts to defend the United States. And this is not to say that we shouldn't do whatever is necessary to try to clean each of these situations up. I just want to know, though, am I correct in saying that we have many of these remedial sites that we should be paying attention to, and this is one of them?
You are correct in saying that. And I think in some ways, the Department of Defense has been open and active in seeking alternative solutions. It's many times hard to innovate in this space where the engagement of regulatory agencies is present and heavy. And, you know, I think that we could, in the case of Vieques, the idea of adaptive management is something that we could think about, where we can tackle that most significant pathway, right? Let's find out where the most significant burdens are happening and deal with that, and not try to let perfect be the enemy of the good, right? We have to, it's a severe situation there, and we need to identify those most important pathways and shut those off as quickly as possible to prevent those diseases.
And I agree with that. And are there studies right now ongoing which are doing exactly what you just said, trying to identify what we should do as quickly as we can do it?
Well, I would say that there's research in that space that in the kind of realm of research, I would say that's absolutely the case. It's sometimes hard when you have a prescriptive process like CERCLA to engage in those types of activities, but I would say that yes, that's something that people are aware of and open to and recognizes has a lot of value.
And I had actually written down as my third question for you, and I'll just make it the last one given the lateness of the hour. But what in your opinion is the worst contaminant, if you will, putting the people at the greatest risk?
Boy, that's a great question. I can't even answer that question. I would just say that there's a lot of different contaminants and a lot of different types. Congresswoman Gonzalez asked about perchlorate, which is very soluble and moves very easily and can be in drinking water and can have a lot of different effects. And then there's contaminants that are more likely to be in seafood. And we don't even know what the synergistic effects may be of cadmium and mercury and TNT and RDX and perchlorate, right? And so if we think about that, it's an impossible thing to understand. I typically think of where I want what kind of environment I want my children to live in, and what kind of seafood I want them to eat, and I just know it doesn't have those levels of many different contaminants. It's a great question. I just don't have an answer.
All right. Well, thank you, Doctor. And to let the record be clear, I'm totally supportive of doing something. I just fear that there are many other places that deserve the same type of attention, but I'm glad we're focusing on this one. With that, I yield back.
Gentlemen yields. Is there any other members that have not had the opportunity to ask questions of the witnesses that wish to be recognized that I don't see as present at this point?
And I don't know if there's somebody else, but I would like to introduce the documents of the record, if you allow me.
Please.
Yes, the first one will be we're talking about explosive, but MTBE is a fuel additive, and it's suspected to cause cancer. And a fuel tank in the base was detected to have a leaked MTBE. And the EPA says humans cannot drink water with this contaminant due to taste after 40 micrograms per liter. In 2020, testing showed that the contamination was 240 milligrams per liter. So the report that I do have here, I would love to introduce this for the record as well. You got a study for the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, published in August 14 for 2005, trace elements analysis in forage samples from a U.S. Navy bombing range in Vieques, as well as we would love to include the Naval Facilities Engineering Command report, final report for the 5-year review report on the Atlantic Fleet Weapons Training Area in Vieques. This is from September 2018. And final remedial action annual status report 2020 for area concerns E, Atlantic Fleet Weapons Training Area, former Naval Ammunition Support Detachment in Vieques. This is a report for November the 1st of 2020. And this is commanded by the Naval Facilities Engineer System and Command. This is the Navy and their subcontractor NASD. We would love to introduce for the record as well another report from the same Naval Facilities Engineering Command in Norfolk, Virginia, demonstrating hazard levels of benzene up to 2017. So we are including this to the record as well.
Without objection, entered into the record, and thank you. Thank you very much to the ranking member. And now I didn't ask questions, but let me just really quickly. First of all, my thanks to the mayor and Ms. Pagan for your advocacy and for your testimony. Many of the questions that I had written down were covered by other colleagues, and I appreciate that. And thank you for your leadership on this issue. Dr. Gardner, the dramatically higher instances of disease in Vieques, ranging from cancer to kidney disease to lupus and others, that's disproportionately high rates in Vieques compared to the mainland of Puerto Rico. What's the central explanation for that difference?
That's a great question, Mr. Chairman. I think it's pretty clear that it associated with the contamination of the island, that the connection between exposure to chemicals, body burdens of chemicals and disease outcomes is really not my area of expertise, but it's also just
yeah, I asked that. Yeah, and I have the reaction you have, that there's a substance of information, studies, reports, some which have been entered into the record by Ms. Gonzalez Colon today, plus others that are part of the legislative record, that beg the question: are we going to redebate contamination? I think that's a given. And so we're moving on to the areas that we were talking about today. How treatment, which is the health facility and availability, resources for residents that need to be compensated for their losses, both on a personal level and on a property level. And then the points that you were talking about, the remediation, the prevention by identifying those and disrupting those pathways, and restoration. It's not a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, but if we acknowledge the fact that the contamination and the effect on human life is severe, then there's a dual track here that one doesn't eliminate the other. Sometimes on these issues we get, oh, let's do more fact finding, let's do another study. And in the interim, we can continue to pull the time out. I think there's a dual track here, and this deals with the very public health and some level of mitigation and restoration and compensation for victims. Fine, that's one track. The other track is the one that was being talked about earlier, and that has to do with what you brought up: remediation, restoration, which is the goal of everybody that spoke today from Vieques, and disrupting those pathways as they exist. So, am I fairly close in reacting to what I heard today?
In my opinion, yes. And I would say that there are very few studies of where grossly contaminated areas have been causally linked to disease outcomes in some population of people. It's extremely difficult to do. People are complex. They live different ways. They eat different things. That people get cancer for no apparent reason in childhood or later on in adulthood. And so those causal links are extremely difficult to make. And so, but I agree with you that in my opinion, that the prove innocent until proven guilty is great for criminal justice, but innocent until proven guilty is not appropriate for environmental contamination.
Thank you. Yeah, I really don't have any more questions. And I think there's urgency to this legislation. I've been advised by the staff that Ms. Representative Porter joined us, and she recently held an oversight hearing on ash coal and the contamination it's causing in another part of Puerto Rico and on that. And so if she wants to speak, then she's recognized for 5 minutes. If not, I'll adjourn the meeting. Ms. Porter, you're recognized if you for 5 minutes. No? Hearing none, let me just thank the witnesses again. Thank our colleagues on the committee for their legislation, both Ms. Velasquez and Ms. Gonzalez Colon. And like I said, there's an urgency to it, and hopefully we can meld the two pieces of legislation